They thought you were gone, didn't they? They looked around and didn't see your name echoing in their hollow rooms. They didn't hear your footsteps, didn't feel your breath brush the back of their neck. You weren't posting your pain. You weren't screaming your struggle. You weren't begging for their attention, their validation, their crumbs of concern. So they assumed you had faded. But let them assume. Let them feast on the illusion they built with their own noise. Because while you said nothing, they said everything. Every whisper behind your back was a confession. Every mockery was an admission. They had to talk about you to feel something again. Because your silence, it was a mirror. And in it, they saw their fear reflected. You sat quiet, but not because you were defeated, not because you had nothing left. You sat quiet because you were watching, listening, observing their patterns like a wolf in the snow, tracking the scent of prey. You were still because stillness is sacred, because those who move without noise are the ones who strike without warning. They mistook your calm for cowardice. They mistook your stillness for surrender. But what they never understood, what they never wanted to understand, was that silence is a weapon, a strategy, a language spoken only by those too powerful to explain themselves. You weren't lost. You were building, brick by unseen brick, breath by steady breath. You were putting pieces back together with bloodied hands and no witnesses, no applause, no sympathy. Only the sound of your own heartbeat echoing through a war zone no one else dared to enter. You didn't need their stage. You had your own battlefield, and on it, you trained in shadows. Let them talk, let them joke, let them feel invincible under the lights of their temporary spotlight. Because the thing about lights, they burn out. And the thing about noise, it fades. But silence echoed. And you became an echo that never needed volume. You became the stillness that made even the loudest fools pause. Because when they no longer heard your cry, when your name didn't show up in their filtered feed, when your absence became louder than their presence, they started to panic. They asked questions without asking them. They threw shade at ghosts and wondered why the room got cold. They mistook your silence for disappearance. But silence was never the absence of power. It was the containment of it. You sat quiet. Because healing makes no sound. Because growth doesn't shout. Because rebirth doesn't ask permission. They couldn't see you rising, so they thought you stayed down. But you were the seed buried under dirt, forgotten by sight, but not by nature. You cracked open in the dark, split apart to become something stronger. You didn't need the sun. You became your own fire. They threw soil on your name, thinking it was a burial, not realizing it was a planting. They fed rumors, thinking it would drown you, not knowing you drank poison like water and grew anyway. They danced in their loudness, thinking volume was victory. But your silence was not surrender. It was preparation. They wanted a reaction. They got your absence. They wanted a meltdown. They got a monument. Every time you didn't respond, you built. Every time you walked away, you grew. Every time you stayed silent, you carved power into your spine. Because you were never gone. You were watching. You were sharpening. You were becoming. And when the time comes, when the dust settles and the silence shifts, they won't hear you coming. Because you've become the storm they never saw on the radar. A force of nature with no need for warning sign. You sat quiet. They panicked loud. And now, they don't know what's coming, but they feel it. Every second you remain silent, their fear grows louder because they finally understand. The one who says the least often holds the most. You were the calm. Now you're the consequence. It screams for attention like a child that's never been taught silent. People talk to feel alive. They shout to feel heard. They post. They brag. They whisper behind backs, all in an attempt to fill the void they refuse to face. Because when the noise dies, the truth walks in. And truth has a voice so quiet, it terrifies the loud. You noticed it, didn't you? The ones who laughed the hardest when you were broken, they were always surrounded by an audience because they couldn't face you alone. They needed their wolves beside them, howling into the void, trying to turn a whisper into thunder. But thunder doesn't make lightning, noise doesn't make power, and crowds don't make courage. They shouted to drown you out. They mocked you because they knew, they felt what was coming, and it scared them. They had to say your name in rooms you weren't even in, just to feel in control of the version of you they invented, because the real you, the one they could no longer read, reach, or predict, was evolving in silence. And that silence, it was louder than anything they could scream. The loudest ones always shake the most. That's the thing about bark. It hides teeth, too afraid to bite. It's the desperate yelp of an insecure soul dressed in confidence. It's a shield, a decoy, a smoke signal. Wolves bark into the wind when they know the predator is near. Empty drums echo across the plains, hoping someone mistakes sound for substance. But you never needed to shout. You didn't bark. You stared, and that stare said everything. It pierced through their noise like a blade through fog. They couldn't understand it. Why weren't you fighting back? Why weren't you defending yourself in their twisted court of gossip and judgment? Why weren't you proving your worth? Because you didn't need to. Let them throw their tantrums. Let them chant their delusions and dance in their own storm. You knew what they didn't. Still water runs deep. Quiet rooms hold sacred power, and the one who says nothing often knows everything. Their fear was never about your silence. It was about what that silence meant. It meant you saw through them. It meant you weren't giving them the reaction they craved. It meant you had moved beyond their frequency. And that kind of peace, that kind of power, it's terrifying to those who survive off chaos. They needed the crowd. You needed the silence. They counted followers. You counted moments. They spoke for applause. You acted for legacy. They were loud because they needed to feel in control. You were silent because you were in control. And then the shift began. The power started leaking out of their words. The applause didn't hit the same. The jokes stopped landing. Because without someone to target, their act fell apart. You were the backbone of their narratives. And when you stopped showing up, the mask began to crack. Chaos thrives until someone refuses to engage. You removed yourself from the fire, and they burned alone. You exited the echo chamber, and they started screaming louder, hoping to be heard. But the silence didn't break. You didn't flinch, and that stillness was deafening. It made them look inward, and they didn't like what they saw. Because now, without your name on their lips, without your pain as their punchline, they were left with only themselves and the noise they created to avoid that very reckoning. They feared your strength, but they feared your silence more, because silence meant you were no longer playing their game. You took your story out of their hands and rewrote it in a language only warriors speak. You became fluent in solitude. You stopped waiting to be understood. You stopped explaining your worth to people who didn't speak your truth. And when you did that, when you chose silence over spectacle, grace over gossip, stillness over spectacle, they panicked. Their noise began to sound hollow. Their voices cracked under the weight of their own insecurities. They shouted louder, but no one listened, because you weren't there to validate their existence anymore. They were never the strong one. They were never the wise one. They were never ahead. You were just silent. You were just patient. You were just rising, slowly, fiercely, without needing to announce your arrival. Let the world talk. Let them bark, scream, gossip, and dramatize. Let them scramble for control in a world that rewards volume over value. You know now. You've seen through it all. Power doesn't perform. It chooses when to speak. It decides when to act. And when it does, it doesn't need a microphone. It doesn't need a crowd. It just moves. Like thunder without warning. Like a storm that never asked for permission. And you are that storm. They didn't just overlook you. They dismissed you, brushed you aside like dust on their polished image, smiled to your face while loading the knife behind their back. They treated your silence like weakness, your humility like invisibility, and when you didn't fight for their crumbs of attention, They labeled you broken. You were the afterthought in their conversation, the name they skipped over when discussing futures, the punchline when they needed to feel taller. They laughed because they couldn't see you bleeding, because your wounds weren't broadcast, because your pain wasn't performance art. You suffered in silence, and they mistook it for emptiness. But you remember, don't you? You remember standing in that room full of familiar faces and feeling like a ghost. You remember the invitations that never came, the messages left unread, the slow withdrawal of warmth from people who once claimed they'd never leave. You remember the "I've got your back" turning into "I barely know you." You remember watching them clap for others while turning their back on you. And it hurt. God, it burned. Not because you needed them, but because a part of you believed they were different. Because you showed up for people who never planned to show up for you. You gave loyalty like it was oxygen, and they held it like smoke, disappearing the moment it became inconvenient. They didn't just underestimate you. They tried to erase you. They looked at your quiet nature and assumed there was nothing beneath it. They saw your kindness as softness, your stillness as surrender. They never bothered to ask what your silence was hiding, because they didn't want to know. They didn't want to face the reality that the person they deemed unremarkable was building something unstoppable. They chose the loud, the glittering, the temporary, and you became a shadow in their world, invisible, forgettable, but you never disappeared. You were simply retreating into your own fire, becoming, forging, turning flesh into steel, and doubt into fuel. They saw your retreat and called it a breakdown. They saw your solitude and called it failure. But they didn't see the nights you spent tearing yourself apart just to find the pieces that still burned with purpose. They didn't see the way you held your own shattered spirit in trembling hands and whispered, "Not yet, not like this." Because while they were laughing, you were healing. While they were celebrating your collapse, you were plotting your resurrection. They didn't want to know the truth, that you cried in silence so others could breathe easy, that you endured betrayal without turning bitter, that every time they chose someone else, every time they pushed you away, every time they left, you got stronger. Your pain became a forge. Your tears became ink. Your loneliness became your laboratory, and your ghost became a giant. They didn't hear the storms you calmed alone. They didn't see you drown in doubt and drag yourself back from the edge. They saw only what was visible and called it all. But giants don't need to be seen to exist. They shake the ground from beneath. You didn't need their eyes. You needed your fire. And once it lit, you realized you were never small. They were just too blind to see your scale. They called you invisible because they couldn't comprehend your depth. They called you weak because they feared your silence. They called you lost because you walked a path they were never brave enough to take. Let them whisper. Let them laugh. Let them play kings and queens in castles made of dust, because the kingdom you're building is rooted in storms and stone. You became a ghost to their world. But in your world, you're a giant, unshaken, untouchable, undeniable. And when they finally turn to look, when their eyes finally open to the truth they once ignored, they won't be able to comprehend what you've become. Because the one they mocked, the one they doubted, the one they left in the dark, has now become the dark, powerful, endless, and far beyond reach. They thought you vanished, but you were right there, breathing, bleeding, becoming. They didn't see you, because they never looked deep enough, because the light they worshipped never reached the places you chose to go. You weren't hiding. You were planting roots in hell. While they danced in the glow of shallow victories, you were buried beneath the weight of silence, alone, unseen, unheard, but alive, burning from within like a furnace sealed shut, silent on the outside, unstoppable within. They were chasing noise. You were chasing transformation. The nights were long, the kind that made time feel cruel. You sat with your wound, not to wallow, but to understand them. Every scar a symbol, every ache a message. You didn't numb it. You didn't run. You leaned into the fire and let it teach you who you are. The world thought you were losing, but you weren't losing. You were shedding the mask of acceptance, the chains of approval, the weight of pretending. You let it all burn, and in those ashes, you started to rise. No trumpet, no parade, just a heartbeat and a hunger too sacred to be witnessed by those who never bled for it. They judged your silence. You were studying. They mocked your solitude. You were sharpening. They celebrated your absence. You were building something they'd never understand, because they built for applause. You built for eternity. Their foundations were ego. Yours was pain, and pain, when embraced, doesn't rot. It roots, it deepens, it anchors. The dungeon became your cathedral. Where others heard echoes of defeat, you heard prophecy. Where they saw walls, you saw mirrors. You didn't scream for rescue. You listened to the cracks, to the silence, to the ancient part of you that still believed. I was made for more than this. You trained, not just your body, your mind, your will, your spirit. Every rejection, a rep. Every betrayal, a lesson. Every silence, a sacred vow. I will rise, but not as I was. You didn't just come back. You rebuilt from the marrow. You stopped asking to be saved. You became your own resurrection. While they celebrated empty victories, you learned patience. While they counted likes, you counted steps. While they climbed ladders, you were digging tunnels straight through stone. No shortcuts, no applause, just the grind, the work, the whispers to yourself at 3 a.m. Keep going. This pain is building something. And it was. They thought the darkness broke you, but the darkness built you. It showed you what comfort could never teach. It revealed the power of discomfort, the wisdom in being alone, the truth that no one will hand you freedom. You forge it yourself, one painful, deliberate breath at a time. You stopped needing eyes on you. You stopped chasing permission because you saw yourself, and that sight was enough. The world rewards noise, but legacy is born in silence, in the trenches, in the quiet moments no one claps for. You didn't build for their validation. You built because you had to, because something in you refused to die quietly. They thought you were gone. You weren't gone. You were growing, like roots under frozen earth, like pressure under stone, like the eye of the storm, still but deadly. And now the ground trembles with every step you take. Now they feel your presence before you even speak, because what's born in the dark carries the power of both shadow and fire. You are that fire, and they won't see it coming. They laughed until they realized you weren't laughing back. They kept calling your name in jest, but the echo never returned. At first, they didn't notice. The room was too loud, their jokes too rehearsed. They thought your silence was submission. They thought your exit was failure. They thought you were done, until the silence grew teeth, until the room felt colder without your presence, until the world they once ruled with noise suddenly felt empty. They began to wonder where you went, the one they used to poke fun at, the one they felt superior to, the one who used to smile and take it. Where did you go? They searched for you in their circles, but you'd outgrown the cage. You didn't leave, you evolved. You didn't vanish, you elevated. And they felt it, not in words, in atmosphere. Something shifted. Their games didn't entertain you anymore. Their opinions couldn't touch you. Their stage lights dimmed the moment you stopped watching. You took your energy with you, and the spotlight followed. At first, they played it off, pretended you never mattered, laughed a little louder, hoping no one would hear the echo of their fear. But panic has a peculiar scent. It starts subtle, a twitch, a crack, a forced smile in a room full of mirrors. They thought they were the storm, until you showed them what stillness can do. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was a signal, a quiet before something greater, a recalibration of power. And now they whisper your name differently, not in mockery, in uncertainty, because you no longer fit their script. You no longer dance to the rhythm of their control. You no longer beg for seats at their table. You built your own throne in the fire they left you in. They don't know how to handle that. They panic when they can't place you. when you stop reacting, when you move with purpose, not permission. Because control isn't always noise. Sometimes it's a stare, a silence too calm to be safe, a smile that doesn't seek approval, a presence that doesn't shrink for anyone. They feel it now, the power shift, the absence of your vulnerability, replaced by something colder, sharper. You're no longer playing their games. You're rewriting the rules. They throw chaos. You stand still. They gossip. You build. They scream. You smile. Because now you understand. They're loudest when they're weakest. They only ever shouted to drown out their own doubt. You made peace with yours. You sat with your demons until they called you king. You are no longer the player in their theater. You are the silence that dims the stage. And they feel it, not all at once, but piece by piece. The way shadows move when light no longer favors the loud. The way people notice when someone no longer needs them to be whole. They realize you didn't disappear. You ascended. While they argued over crowns made of paper, you forged yours from iron and fire. While they performed for applause, you were becoming the force that no longer required it. You didn't just walk away. You outgrew the room. And now the room shrinks in your absence. This is the panic. This is the unraveling. Not with a scream, but with the still terrifying truth that you were never weak. You were preparing. The loudest battles you ever faced were the ones no one saw. Not the critics, not the enemy, not the liars in the room, but the whispers in your own head. The shadows didn't come from outside. They came from within. Doubt, fear, rage, abandonment. They weren't just emotion. They were monsters, and they wore your face. You didn't just fight the world. You fought yourself. Every step forward came with a voice behind it, saying, "You're not good enough. You'll fail again." They were right about you, but you kept walking. You kept walking through the smoke of memories that tried to choke you. You kept walking past the ruins of places where love used to live. You kept walking into the fire, even when your hands were already burnt. You didn't flinch, even when the mirror turned on you. Even when your reflection looked more like a ghost than a survivor. You faced it. You stared into those eyes, tired, red, haunted, and you whispered, "I'm still here." You gave yourself what no one else could. A second chance, a quiet nod, a silent rebellion. No audience, no savior, just you. And the decision to stand. They'll never understand the nights you couldn't breathe, the mornings that didn't feel real, the way your own thoughts sometimes curled like knives in your chest. They won't see that. They only see the version of you that came out, not the one who crawled through their own mind to get here. But I see it. I see the hands that shook, but still reached forward. I see the voice that cracked, but still spoke truth. I see the eyes that cried, but still looked up instead of down. That is not weakness. That is warriorhood. You didn't need a battlefield to bleed. You bled in silence so heavy, it felt like drowning in air. You were surrounded by ghosts, the ghosts of who you were, the ghosts of who you tried to be, the ghosts of who you lost just trying to be seen. But you stood in that graveyard and didn't bury yourself. You didn't numb it. You didn't fake peace. You met your monsters. You didn't flinch. You didn't cover the scars. You read them. You didn't silence the fear. You stared it down until it blinked. And that's power. Not the kind that roars, the kind that breathes, the kind that rebuilds with trembling fingers and refuses to quit, even when hope is on its last breath. You didn't run from the dark. You sat with it. You let it show you the truth the light was too afraid to say. You let it strip you of illusions, of ego, of everything that was never truly yours. And what remained? You. Real, raw, unpolished and unshakable. Not perfect, not healed, but present. And presence, when earned in pain, carries a force louder than any scream. You were the storm long before they noticed. But first, you had to survive your silence. They were watching, waiting for a reaction, waiting for you to scream, to break, to crack under the weight of what they did. But you didn't scream. You didn't post about it. You didn't rant. You didn't throw your pain across the sky like some desperate flare. You just disappeared. And somewhere in that silence, you changed. They wanted your anger. You gave them your absence. They wanted your breakdown. You gave them distance. They wanted to trigger you, to see if they could still touch what they broke. But the version of you that bled for their approval, that version died in the quiet. And what rose in its place didn't need to speak to be heard. You started rising in places they couldn't see. You started glowing in rooms they no longer had keys to. You started becoming not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. You didn't clap back. You outgrew the arena. And now they sit in the seats of their own circus, wondering why their show isn't the same without your pain to point at. You walked away from their stage and built your own kingdom in the shadows. No announcement, no parade, just slow, steady, deliberate evolution. They wanted a reaction. You gave them results. They waited for a sign you were broken, and instead saw the silhouette of someone who no longer needed to explain. You didn't post revenge. You lived it. You didn't flex the comeback. You became it, because true transformation doesn't need a spotlight. It carries its own gravity. And you became the kind of force that shifts the atmosphere just by entering the room. You rose, and you didn't make a sound. No apologies, no explanation, no validation borrowed from the mouths of those who once laughed at your fall. You didn't come back for them. You came back for you. You remembered the weight of who you are. You dusted off the silence like armor, and when you stood, the world didn't know whether to clap or collapse. Because the scariest kind of strength is the one that doesn't seek attention. It's the one that builds in shadows, moves with intention, and doesn't look back. You became that, not overnight, but through the 1,000 quiet choices no one will ever see. You didn't rise for their approval. You rose because staying small was choking your spirit. You changed, and you didn't ask permission. They expected a meltdown. You gave them a masterpiece. They expected noise. You gave them a revelation. You became what they were never prepared for, a healed version of you that doesn't need to be loud to be legendary. So now when they talk, it sounds hollow. Now when they whisper, it sounds weak. Because nothing echoes louder than the presence of someone who no longer needs to prove a thing. You are the comeback they never saw coming. Because you didn't announce it, you embodied it. Now they are the ones who can't stop talking. Not because they have something to say, but because silence terrifies them now. Funny, isn't it? The ones who mocked your stillness, who called your silence weakness, now panic in the echo chamber they built with their own noise. You sat quiet. They panicked loud. Their laughter used to echo through every room you entered. Now it echoes back at them, empty, broken, desperate. They didn't expect to miss what they once dismissed, but regret has a way of repeating itself, louder every time you don't answer. Their words are heavier now because they carry guilt, they carry shame. And you're nowhere near the fire they started. You're walking through your own garden, one they tried to salt, but you bloomed anyway. Their judgment once felt like thunder. Now it sounds like static. They doubted you when you needed them. Now they need you, and you're gone. Not in anger, not in spite, but in elevation. You outgrew the space where they kept their power. You don't live in their words anymore. You don't flinch at their silence, because their silence now, it's haunted. They wonder where you went. But the truth is, you didn't go anywhere. You just stopped shrinking to be seen. You built walls from the bricks they threw. You carved wings from the bones of every betrayal. And now you fly in skies they can't breathe in. They tried to bury you in their doubt, but forgot you were seated, not silent. And as you rose, they watched, first in confusion, then in disbelief, then in fear. Because nothing is more terrifying to a manipulator than the one who no longer responds. You became the storm they said would never come. You became the flood in the drought they tried to leave you in. Their pride is coughing now. Their ego is choking. Because the same voices that mocked your fall now tremble at your rise. They talk too much now, trying to rewrite the past, trying to explain what they never understood. But the truth doesn't need defending. You never had to scream back. Your success screams for you. You never had to burn bridges. You just walked away. and the fire followed them. Now they sit with the ghosts of their own words. Now they remember every time they laughed, and can't forget the way you didn't laugh back. Because silence doesn't forget. It records, it watches, and when it returns, it doesn't come as a whisper. It comes as a reckoning. Their fear is loud now, louder than your absence, louder than their lies, louder than any apology they'll never give. But you've made peace with their noise, because the higher you climb, the quieter it gets, and the louder they become. You don't wait anymore. Not for recognition, not for permission, not for a seat at their table, because you built your own from the ashes they left you in. They thought they were burying you, but they were building your kingdom. You were the warning they ignored. Now you're the consequence. You don't ask to be seen. Your presence demands attention. You don't shout to be heard. Your silence has become an earthquake. You are no longer the one waiting outside the gate. You are the gate, and not everyone gets to pass through. They used to walk past you with blind eyes and loud mouths. Now they feel the ground shift before you even enter the room. You don't react. You lead. You don't whisper. You shake mountains, because now you are the storm. The storm that doesn't beg the sky for approval. The storm that doesn't care who's watching. The storm that knows its purpose is to tear down everything that tried to cage it. Lightning doesn't ask permission to strike. It simply does. And you've become that bolt, raw, radiant, relentless. They tried to define you by your silence, but never realized silence is the breath before the roar. And you've roared, not with noise, but with legacy. Your rise is not temporary. It is tectonic. You shifted the plates beneath their world. And now, nothing stands where they thought they had power. They called you broken. Now they call you unreachable. They labeled you lost. Now they label you dangerous. But you were never broken. You were becoming. You were never lost. You were rebuilding, brick by bloody brick. They only saw the cracks. They didn't see the foundation and being reforged in silence. They underestimated the stillness, not realizing that peace in the right hands is lethal. Because when peace comes after war, it is not fragile. It is earned. And you earned every breath, every scar, every step out of that grave they made for you. You are not the same. You're colder now, but wiser. You're quieter, but louder in every room.